everybody. Welcome back to another segment. I'm Hillary Raimo. You're listening to Matters for Mind, Body, and Spirit Talk Radio. Back on December 16th, I had a wonderful, fabulous, very inspiring guest join me, Dr. Judy Wood, to talk about the weaponization of free energy technology and the reality of them, and how 9/11 was an example of this according to the evidence that she has collected. She is a scientist. She works from data. She doesn't make speculations or go into theories. She's not a conspiracy theorist. She doesn't get into so much the who done it, but the how have they done it. And the show was so powerful. I received a tremendous amount of feedback from people. It really was an effective show. She spoke very clearly about the evidence that she has been sharing very passionately online and in different venues. She holds a bachelor's in civil engineering and also structural engineering. She holds a master's in engineering mechanics and applied physics and a PhD in materials engineering science from the Department of Engineering Science and Mechanics at Virginia Polytech Institute and State University in Blacksburg, Virginia. So I've invited her back because she has a new book coming out at some point, and I've been privileged enough to see a few chapters of that book. And I also feel that I had some more questions for her, and other people had questions for her as well that wrote in after the show. I received a flood of emails from people asking, very, very specific questions about her research, people who had not heard of her before, people who have heard of her. So I have invited her back on for another hour because the evidence that she has collected over the past, since 2001 has an overwhelming effect on people when you really sit down and take a look at it and start to question the subcultures that we're exposed to. Now, before we begin, I would like to very, very, passionately say to everybody out there that this was a very traumatic event for everybody on the planet. And this is in no way a disrespectful conversation to the people who lost their lives. I think in really looking for the truth as to what happened, we are actually, in fact, trying to pay homage to those people who passed away. This is not about sensationalism or, trying to bring the topic in to use it for any other way, except for exposing the truth and really trying to find what happened. Because when you look at Dr. Wood's evidence, and when you look at her website, and you can follow along with us tonight, and that's really what I suggest you do, is you get on your computers and you go to drjudywood.com and you look at the pictures and you follow along, because the impact of looking at the pictures and listening to her evidence and what she says really is just eye-opening. Welcome, Dr. Judy Wood. Thank you so much for joining me again.
Well, thank you for having me back.
Well, I have to say we have a lot of material to cover, even in 2 shows, and I really don't know what to say to begin, because I don't want to cover material we've already really talked about in setting up some of the background to this. In part 1, people can always go into my archives on Achieve Radio and listen to part 1 and then follow into part 2. But I think we have so much really incredible material to cover that it's important to just kind of move on into what we were trying to get to in the first hour. So, Judy, where do you stand on this whole topic of on your website here? As I'm looking at it as I talk to you, you have a really large amount of your website dedicated to Star Wars directed energy weapons, what you call DEW, the Hutchinson effect, and things along those lines. So when people look at the website and they see this on there, are they to assume that, this is what you feel has created the evidence and data that you've been studying all these years?
No, and I have a statement on there about that the first big series it's called the Star Wars direct energy weapons. You heard that, you remember the Star Wars program, term from the Reagan era for the Strategic Defense Initiative. That's what it was called. but everybody knew about it. Everybody knew there's lots of dollars being poured into it. And when I first started putting up this information, folks said energy weapons don't exist. That's impossible. And it's just, Buck Rogers or so far in the future. Well, what went on all that time during the, Star Wars program? $1 gazillion or however much went into that for years. And before that was a forerunner to that program. You mean they keep pouring money into a program that's totally useless? You mean they haven't had any R&D work, research and development since 1945? Atomic bomb. Microwave ovens came to be around 1945. Then we had lasers in the mid-50s were developed. Hasn't technology come a lot further since then? We don't hear about it, but we know we had the Star Wars program. So the people in the Star Wars program, they were researching energy weapons. So that was my kind of hint to, this is real. Now, other countries surely have, the analogous department studying energy weapons. The energy weapons have been around for many years. And so I first named it that as a way of establishing, it exists, so can we move on? Energy weapons are here and now. Hey, what do you do with a remote control of your TV? That's a kind of if you use it as a weapon, a direct energy weapon, but it's directed energy. There's various series where I focus on things, but if folks want to go to a nice, little bit of everything page, the Cliff Notes page, which is drjudywood.com/WTC. And from there, you see some little guys at the top waving. It says index. They're not the rest of the page down, but there's a little index above each section. And that shows you also, when you click on that, you'll see all the different categories of evidence, or most of them, and different things that need to be explained. So if you want to jump to different sections, you can, and then hit that little index thing above each section to jump back to this section. So it's like everything on one page.
Yeah, last time we had spent some time discussing the first few parts of this page, actually, where we discussed the dust and the actual structural collapse of the building. So we did cover that in part one for those of you tuning in perhaps for the first time. So moving on into some of these, is it a dangerous topic to talk about these directed energy weapons programs? A lot of people are very hesitant to get into discussing it publicly. Is it because is it a dangerous thing to do, or is it not welcomed by the people who run these programs, or is that just something that it seems to be like not true?
well, you get marginalized big time. And the biggest thing that is the connection they don't want anyone to make with 9/11 is the connection to free energy. This is free energy technology.
So if we admitted that we had this technology to use as a weapon, we'd have to admit that we also have it for the positive aspects also, right?
Exactly. And if it's not the U.S.'s technology, so I'm not saying who did it. If it's not the U.S.'s technology that did it, why isn't someone studying what happened? So, because obviously it's a wonderful technology used for good things. So if U.S. doesn't have such technology, they would want to study this to acquire it.
Mm-hmm. Well, it certainly makes you stop and think, because there's a lot.
Whoops. I don't hear anything.
Working, and there is also an air of we haven't discovered it yet.
Just got cut off for a second.
Did we lose you?
Yeah, I'm back.
Yeah, okay. Well, the connection's a little sketchy, so we'll have to play it, as we go. Welcome to live show, folks.
Yeah.
Speaking of technology, if we have all this technology, we should be able to make the internet connections better. In my opinion.
Right. But then you take jobs away from people who need, to repair. problem.
Yeah, well, what I was getting at before you broke off there for a second was that there are people who are perpetuating the funding of research for free energy technology, wanting to build free energy technology, but the fact is that it's already been built. Yes?
Right. And it's been demonstrated. John Hutchison has demonstrated it, but Nikola Tesla demonstrated it. John Hutchison was only replicating Nikola Tesla's work from 100 years ago. So, yeah, it exists. But if you poured all sorts of money into the Collider project, all sorts of free energy development, it looks like we don't have it. And you can convince people we don't have it.
What do you think the Collider project is all about?
Who knows? Unless you go visit them and, sit there for 24 hours a day and watch them. No way you know.
I was just curious if you had a thought on that. It is interesting to watch money kind of evaporate into the funding and the wishful wanting of these kinds of things. And if we already have them, makes you wonder, how long we've had them and how long we could have been out of this state of the world that we're in today. So, Judy, moving on into your research and what you have put together as evidence. Now, I have to be honest with you. When I was reading what you sent me for a preview for this show, there was a chapter in there that was extraordinarily difficult, and I talked to you about this before we came on the air tonight, that was really hard for me to get through, which was about the jumpers. Well, I think it's important to talk about what you were trying to say scientifically from what we were observing there. I'm just going to let you jump into it.
Yeah, this chapter is about opening your eyes and observing. It's towards the beginning of the book, where the idea is to, we saw these people who appeared to have jumped out, and we were told they jumped out. And once humans are given an answer, they quit asking questions. That's something I've discovered. So people don't go back usually and reevaluate it.
My mind didn't want to go back. My mind didn't want to keep reading it.
Right.
And it was interesting because you had addressed that in the beginning of the chapter where you said most people, when they come to this kind of, topic, they don't want to, there's a denial aspect. But what I found fascinating was the parts where you pointed out where people were hanging on the side of the buildings, getting undressed, taking their clothes off.
Right.
And I didn't understand that because when I read what you wrote, I had to really second guess that. And that's really what I walked away from that chapter with was why were they hanging off the building 100 stories up? And there was a very clear picture of a gentleman taking his pants off. Why would they be wanting to take their pants off? And so I'd like you to talk about the science of, what you feel was going on there, because it's important.
Well, when I got into this, I just collected a whole bunch of the jumper pictures, and I tried to imagine what was going through each of their minds, their facial expressions and so forth. And I really felt like they were trying to communicate with us. First, you want to turn away and push it in the background because you don't want to go back and relive that day again. But then when I realized they were communicating with us, these are their last words, their last thoughts, I felt an obligation, and I made a promise to them to tell their story, what it was like from their perspective. And that's the way I started looking at it. Okay, this fellow who's hanging from the 105th floor, taking his pants off, and you notice other ones have.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
There's some that are, falling with the pant leg, trailing. But I got to thinking, if I was on the 105th floor and this fire, I'd be the first one to the bathroom, get my extra clothing that I kept in my desk and soak it down and wrap around my head, soak my body down and head for the door. I'd be wet. Well, if the water had been cut off, or if the sprinklers had gone off, we'd be wet. If the water had been cut off and there wasn't water to our floor, and there was fire, we'd be hot and sweating, and we'd be wet. Any which way you look at it, you'd be wet. So then I'm thinking of this guy who's hanging out window by a hand and a foot, taking his pants off. If there's a problem with smoke, don't you just hold your breath, step inside, and for whatever weird reason he wants to get his pants off, take the pants off, jump back outside, or hang back outside, start breathing again. If there's some peculiar reason he needs to get his pants off, why is he hanging outside by a hand and a foot, the 105th floor, take his pants off? Also, fire, clothes protect you from the fire. If there's fire in there and heat, why do firefighters wear big, heavy coats? To protect them from the fire. Why do you wear a mitt, of your barbecue grill? It protects you from the fire. So why would you want to take your pants off or your shirt off? And especially hanging outside the building, where if you need to get your clothes off, why not just step inside? What could possibly be going on in there that would make wet clothes in an unacceptable condition? Because any which way you look at it, it's probably wet. And also, there didn't seem to be any smoke coming out the window or fumes of any kind. And especially people who are upwind. Like, why do they need to be outside? Well, let's see. Start thinking about other things. We had all this paper that didn't burn. Think of an example. I'm not saying this is what it is, but just as an example. You put in your microwave oven something on a paper towel. The paper towel doesn't burn, but the other stuff cooks. And the active denial system that's used for crowd control, it says, they say it's much, much worse if your skin is wet or the clothing is wet, because it fries the moisture, because the water molecules are getting more excited. So you're much better off to have dry skin. So if you were getting, in the middle of one of these beams from an active denial system, and you're wearing sopping wet clothes, maybe you decide to take your clothes off. Now, the guy obviously wants to live, because why is he still hanging there? And, also, another thing I notice is everyone who looks to be falling is empty-handed. If somebody had chosen to jump, wouldn't they have a picture of their loved one with them? Women have their purse or have something in their hand. These are empty-handed people. And there's one guy's flapping his wings like how did he get here? And he just, doesn't know how he got out there. It's like they're caught by surprise out there. Also, if something is just intolerably uncomfortable, you don't even stop to think about it. Like your hand on a burner of your stove, if you put your hand on that burner and it's hot, you don't have to decide to take it off. Your hand will slide off of there. And I wondered, for a while if that's what it was. But these people didn't seem to be burning up from physical heat, but something else. So that's how I saw that situation.
Well, I thought that was very unusual. I hadn't noticed that. It's not something that we were shown publicly. People hanging out there, but if you're not looking at it from this perspective, or you don't know that, wetness, aggravates the skin more under, different situations such as, microwave exposure or something like that. It was very obvious in that picture in that book that they had taken their clothes off and they were hanging out the window. And it was just phenomenal. It was just a very powerful moment to make that connection. You had also mentioned the distance from the building that they were falling, that if they were just jumping, they would have been falling along the side of the building. And instead they were very far away from the building.
Right. I used the world's record for the standing broad jump from the Olympics of 1906 or so. figuring that was a good number for, the average person, what shoes they have in their office for taking a leap out the window, what speed, and approximated how far they would be going in assuming they're going horizontally as they're falling. By the time if they jump from the highest floor, by the time they get to the lower mechanical floor, which you can see in this picture, maybe they could be about 100 feet from the building. Maybe, if they really, gave it their all. And how could this person be that far? It doesn't make sense that they could drift out that far from the building. There's also body parts found even further away, but that's a different issue. There's also testimony of a body that one firefighter saw come apart and turn into a cloud of red. He kept saying, "I didn't need to see that. I didn't need to see that."
Now, I would assume, being, non-scientific or not understanding how, it's supposed to look, I wouldn't think anything of it. I would just think that they fell from such a large height, from such a long height, that the body's just exploding like that from impact. I wouldn't know any different. I had never seen that. So how is that different?
Well, there's actually a window washer who fell from the 47th story a couple of years ago from a building in New York. He got busted up. His brother didn't live, but he got busted up. But he was in a coma for a while, and he woke up and started talking, and then got his legs fixed and got back in business. It's not likely you're going to survive, but it's possible. The same with hitting a deer, driving at 80 miles an hour, if you go smack into a deer. The deer doesn't pulverize. It doesn't turn into liquid. It gets busted up. It might live a little bit, depending on how things are. If you rushed it to surgery and did CPR on it, whatever, it might survive. But you don't get a piece of fur here, a half a tail over here, a piece of hoof over here, a tooth over there. The deer doesn't come apart like that. You busted up bones, but it's still kind of in the same general area.
So from the 47th floor, he survived the fall?
Yes.
The gentleman that fell? Now, if we're talking another 50 floors, the chances of somebody surviving that are obviously not going to happen. So,
not necessarily. No. The likelihood decreases, but there have been some interesting survivor stories of people with parachutes not opening.
From 100 stories high.
Right. That's at least 100 stories high, where they're jumping from an airplane, and the parachute doesn't open. You get up to terminal velocity, and you don't go much faster.
So their body doesn't disintegrate the way you were describing and turn to a cloud of red dust.
Right. They get busted up. There have been some survivors, but most of them would get busted up. I know that sounds coarse saying it.
Well, this is why I'm saying it was a hard chapter for me to get through, because excuse me, you have to get through the emotional impact of what you're looking at, and it's a very, very difficult thing to look at the pictures that you have in there. But once you get past that, you almost have to just really take on a scientific mind to read the data and just lay aside the emotions and just kind of breathe through it. But when you look at that was a very impactful moment also, because what you explain in there, not so much in this part that I read, which I know you have another chapter that's dedicated more to it, I believe. But I didn't know that. I wouldn't know that. I think that a lot of people on the site that day wouldn't have known that. Or maybe they just were so overwhelmed with what they were experiencing, they didn't process it that way. So I'm wondering if if what you're saying about them being in the building and being exposed to some kind of field, some kind of radiation type field or something, where they're taking their clothes off because it's more uncomfortable to be wet in that field because it perpetuates the pain, etc. that their body is somehow disintegrating from the inside out.
There's not, there's some that's happened. That I have evidence of that's in my next book after this one. That some very strange things happened, and I guess another reason, I'm kind of hesitant to say this, I've not said it on a radio show before, but I guess I can say this about the survival. I have personal experience that it's possible to survive. I was hit by a pickup truck going in excess of 80 miles per hour. And that's about the same as terminal velocity. Not likely you're going to survive. You end up very busted up. That's why I feel that I really could relate to these people. And so I feel like I have personal experience that you can survive. It's unlikely. You end up really busted up. But I felt like I could really relate to these people, and maybe that helped me be able to see through their eyes, being at death's door or whatever. And I felt even more obligated to tell their story because I feel that they would want their story told, what they were experiencing, what was going on in their lives at that moment.
Yeah, it's because it wasn't... well, I have to say, I have seen the pictures where people were falling and what was published, in mainstream media, mainstream news, all of that, those outlets. But I don't recall ever seeing the picture that you have in there where they were hanging out and they weren't dressed, and it doesn't make much sense. And you have to get over that emotional wave first to be able to put that logical, common sense pieces together.
Actually, that was a very well-known published piece that was seen
maybe
in
I
most
just
of the
didn't see
media,
it.
but we didn't observe what was in the picture.
Right. And there was a person who looked like they were actually holding out a phone, trying to record what was happening, and he was holding it out at arm's length in one of the pictures, and it looked like he was trying to record what was going on. Okay, so here we have this happening. And has it happened before? Is this the first time that we've seen something like this? Or do you feel that this is something that has been used in other instances?
Well, on this scale, seeing an entire 110-story building turn to powder in midair, I don't think we've seen that before. How many 110-story buildings are there? And we've not had, these mega skyscrapers, come apart.
Why didn't they just demolish the building? Why couldn't this be just something where they didn't, let's say we go into the truth culture and the truth movement that's out there for 9/11, where it was an inside job and it was blown up by explosives. And so, they have this whole alternative theory about it. Why would they have to use this kind of technology to do it? Why not just use explosives to do it?
It's, for one thing, you don't demolish a building in Manhattan without, causing collateral damage. If that's what the motive is. We don't know what the motive is. We can only, take observations of what we see. But one thing I will say about safety factor in design, structures are designed with a particular, I think I talked about this last time, the safety factor and the importance factor. And if it's out in the middle of a cornfield in Iowa, it's not going to take out anybody else if it falls. But in Manhattan, you got to worry about the adjacent buildings. And I don't think there's any controlled demolition company that would be able to with the most amount of skills and preparation to be able to, take these buildings down without demolishing something across the street. And Building 7 didn't even spill across the street, didn't scratch the post office. But the buildings didn't collapse. They turned to powder. They just kind of went away, gone with the wind.
Let's talk about Building 7 for a second, because Building 7 didn't even get hit by anything, and there were other buildings in between it. And do you feel that that was a side effect of what was happening, or was it seismic? Was there something going on? How did that fall the way that it fell, in your opinion? It
didn't really fall. It appears to have fallen, but I think that's just the facade that did that, because there's no evidence that the building slammed to the ground. There's the various seismic stations in the area couldn't even pick out a signal out of background noise. Some of them could, just barely, and they said it was a 0.6 on the Richter scale, which is, the same as a jackhammer on the sidewalk. A little bit more than a hammer on the table top. Mm-hmm. But it's something you could sleep through, just about. In New York City, for sure, you could sleep through it. But to have a 47-story building where each floor is about the size of a football field, imagine these planes in space with about 250 dump trucks on each floor, and suddenly come crashing to ground. It should sound like raining dump trucks. And you hear one dump truck rumbling down the road, and you're trying to sleep at night, bumpity, bumpity, bump. That's a lot of racket. And the sound was not, appropriate, at an appropriate level for Building 7. And neither was the ground shaking. Well, it didn't shake.
Now, on your website, you make mention of a few things that I find interesting. You talk about the evidence of molecular dissociation and transmutation as demonstrated by the near-instant rusting of affected steel. You also talk about weird fires, the appearance of fire but without evidence of heating, lack of high heat. Witnesses reported that the initial dust cloud felt cooler than ambient temperatures, and there was no evidence of burned bodies, and that columns were curled around a vertical axis like rolled-up carpets, where overloaded buckled beams should be bent around the horizontal axis. And you have pictures of this on your website at drjudywood.com. One thing that I also find interesting was that office paper was densely spread throughout Lower Manhattan that day and unburned alongside often cars that appeared to be burning. So we have a lot of anomalies here with this. And what I'm curious about is, what kind of anomalies do these direct energy weapons create that we lay people who aren't scientists wouldn't know to look for? Are these examples of that?
I call it directed, not directed. It just means energy that gets directed. Is controlled as to where it affects things. What I do in my book is go through simple, everyday examples that we're familiar with where we see this phenomenon, but we don't recognize it as being part of it. For example, something I like to say is hot things glow, but not everything that glows is hot. Folks see things glowing in the pictures, in the aftermath, or see something glowing and they assume it's molten metal or, red hot. But think of a fluorescent light compared to an incandescent light. The fluorescent light doesn't burn your hands. The incandescent one, which is a resistance heating coil it's so hot that it glows. It's a different mechanism that causes the fluorescent light to glow. And so you know that light can be made in different ways. There's also other phenomena that we know. Like if you notice, I call it the swamp, the street where there's just every car was toasted and the paper got wet from the fire hoses and the dust was wet. It looked like a swamp. Every single car was toasted. Nothing else was. There's signposts that were fine. There were trees with leaves still on them and buildings on the sides. Nothing else was toasted. So let's see what the differences are. It wasn't that the gas tank exploded. So you start looking at what the differences are, and you realize the car was on rubber tires. You there?
Yeah, I'm listening.
Oh, heard something.
Yeah.
Didn't know we got cut off again. And so, it's insulated from the ground. perhaps there's something different that happens to it if it's not grounded. And, you start picking up different phenomena like that. But you talk about molecular dissociation. What my aha moment for that was noticing that soon after the dust landed, you slightly upwind, you could see clear blue sky. Then a little bit after that, you start seeing fuzzy stuff around people's feet, and then fuzzy stuff starts rising on its own. And that could only be happening if coarse dust landed and then became fine. So fine that it rose up. Because if it's fine dust that's rising up, how could it have landed? Mm-hmm. Why would it have been on the ground? So it continued breaking down. And then there's a continuing, ongoing reaction. One of the things when I discovered the Hutchison effect was one of the hallmark signs of it, especially in large mass, non-self-quenching was the term that really got me. And we had a non-self-quenching issue going on with Bankers Trust. Bankers Trust had a gash in the front. It was right across from Building 2.
You mentioned on your website it had a cylindrical arc that was cut into it.
Right, and they replaced those beams and columns and then decided to take the building apart.
So you mean they put the building back together and then they decided to take it back apart?
To dismantle it. And I think there's like 1 or 2 stories left, and they're still working on it after 9 years.
Well, you also mentioned the vertical round holes that were cut into buildings 4, 5, and 6 and into Liberty Street in front of Bankers Trust. And so are we dealing with like the same affecting all these buildings, or do you think it was describe to me how this is important, noticing vertical round holes into these particular places?
Vertical round holes aren't natural. Well, not natural as far as, what you get with a building collapse. It's also, you look down, they're empty. There's just nothing in these. And, soon after the day of the event, there's some people climbing down on a long ladder down to the basement, and they're walking through a puddle of water, so, it wasn't hot there. And it's just there's nothing down there. It's empty cavern. And, what's this deal with this hollow hole? How does that happen if you have a collapse? Doesn't make sense. Nothing can fall in it and then pulverize itself as well as the hole. And then I started looking at when I was looking at the Hutchison effect. He had solid aluminum bars with holes that would appear in them, like a vertical hole, to the side, but not all the way through, and then another hole sideways. You couldn't drill it like that, with a normal drilling technique at all. And it's just like it tunnels a cylindrical hole. This reaction, of course, this is a small scale. But, my first inkling was, okay, it's tempting to say something to this hole punch from above, like a post hole digger, but that's thinking of what we know with conventional methods, or somewhat conventional. But if it's a phenomenon that works around an axis, and everything at a particular radial distance from that axis gets destroyed, it seems like what could also be the case.
So these vertical round holes that were cut into the buildings are evidence in your mind, what you're saying with all of this, that it just doesn't add up to the official story, and it doesn't add up to a demolition story, correct?
Right. No, it's not a conventional bombs in the building. It's not anything conventional we've seen before. To see cylindrical holes with material just missing in that cylindrical cutout.
Did they release the pictures of that publicly? I know you have quite a few on your website, and for those of you following along on drjudywood.com, you can find them on there. I don't remember seeing any of them released publicly, like on the news or the people that were covering it. I could be wrong. I mean, it doesn't mean it didn't happen, but I'm just curious if you feel that was perhaps part of what was kind of not really so much part of the story.
The funny thing is, all of this stuff has been out there. it's been out there since the beginning if you looked enough. But are we still connected?
Yes, we're still here. Yeah.
Oh, okay. If you're, like when I first started talking with other people about this, I said, "What about these holes?" And they said, "Oh, that's already been taken care of. We've already ruled out that it was explosive." And like, move on, don't look back, move on. That's what I was thinking. Okay, when most people are given an answer, they quit asking questions. And so if people are told that, then they move on. Oh, somebody already looked into that. Who looked into that? What did they come up with and why? There's a video I have on my book order site, which is going to be available soon, where there's Peter Jennings is talking to George Stephanopoulos. This is at 12:30 on the 12th, the very next day. And Peter Jennings asked George Stephanopoulos, "Where did the buildings go?" And George Stephanopoulos says, "Well, I've been asking around. That it was just such massive buildings. They all fell down and then just turned to dust and evaporated." That's what he said on the 12th. But they noticed the lack of material, and that was okay. He got an answer, so he moved on. But
you think we were kind of duped into? Do you think we were kind of duped into the whole? How did they know who did it within hours after something like that happening? Do you think the majority of people were wrapped up into the anger and scooped up into the whole traumatizing emotional aspect of this to really be settled down to look at this from a more logical perspective, perhaps? Do you think that that's what happened, either intentionally or unintentionally? That's pretty much what happened. People couldn't look at it from that side.
You get them to act on instinct and reaction, and they'll grab their pitchforks and need to go after the bad guy. They don't stop to think, innocent until proven guilty. But no, it's just because they were told this person's guilty or these people are guilty, grab your pitchfork and go after them. And once people, first impressions stick. Once people get that in their mind, it's hard to undo it.
Well, we've had a few years to spend a lot of money in other countries and do a lot of damage because of this too. So there was a lot of consequence following this event, and it's unfortunate. But when we look at these things being presented here, it's very difficult to really not go back and take a look at it and see it from a different perspective. You mentioned some interesting facts that I'd like to read off of your website, and then I'd like to ask you a question in closing, what you feel is going on with some current events in the world. You did mention here that all planes except top secret missions were ordered down until 10:31 a.m. when only military flights were allowed to resume after both towers were destroyed in only 2 minutes, 120 seconds after World Trade Center 1 had been destroyed. Why were all the planes ordered down? Was it because of what was going on, or was it because something was being allowed to happen, in your opinion?
I do not know. That was news reports that I had seen. And we do remember hearing on the news that commercial planes were all grounded. Everybody had to land as soon as they could. But I didn't realize until I'd seen that, and then I put it in that article after I started graphing it. I didn't realize that even military aircraft were told to land.
Ordered down.
But then what were these helicopters that were flying around? I still don't know. So what's the story? Why weren't they ordered to leave? Except top secret mission. Was that top secret mission? We don't know. But one thing is you can speculate and say, well, we had all these toasted cars. Were they afraid of having toasted airplanes in the neighborhood?
Well, what I find also interesting too, and people can make up their own minds about that, because I think there's enough information out there for people to really dig into that on their own too. But with only a few minutes left, we have about 10 minutes left. I'd like to ask you. Now, you also say on here that the magnetic field readings in Alaska were recorded, had recorded abrupt shifts in the Earth's magnetic field with each of the events on the World Trade Center site on 9/11. So with the current happenings with all these birds falling out of the sky and fish bubbling up out of the water on shores and many parts of the United States and also around the world, now these the Earth's magnetic fields, now they're shifting naturally, and yet we also have these things coming in and, playing with them. Is it normal to see a reaction of sorts like that so far away from the actual site? Would you care to talk about the science of that briefly?
It was picked up, I guess, around the Earth and various degrees in various seismic stations. But there's noise here and there, sometimes from space weather. And I checked the space weather for that day, and there wasn't any solar storms. You get weird things happening here and there, but it really when you have every single event of the 5 events, something abruptly happening at the exact same time in the magnetometer readings, it begs the question. Like for about 20 minutes before the North Tower got its hole, I don't make any assumptions on how it got its hole, but for about 20 minutes before that, all of the magnetometers that had been fairly quiet started veering off and decreasing in magnitude from their norm. And as soon as the North Tower got its hole, they abruptly started changed direction, started increasing. And then when the South Tower got its hole, they abruptly leveled off. And then right when the South Tower went poof, destroyed, whatever, they started going down. And then right when Tower 1 went poof, they just dropped off a cliff, really went down. It got me thinking, why does it go down and up and then down, down? And then it was all haywire all afternoon, and then it gets under control right about the time that Building 7 goes poof. And I'm thinking, well, let's see what the pattern is. You have the North Tower getting a hole from north to south, the South Tower getting a hole from south to north. Both towers went poof from top to bottom. Building 7 was destroyed from, all afternoon, but the final demise was bottom to top. So, could it be that one reverses the other in what's happening? No, but with these other, it's just some questions to think about. But one thing that I have been thinking about with birds falling out of the sky is think about how John Hutchison does his magic. It's magic if you don't understand it. That he has a static field, and within that static field, he interferes different types of radio frequency signals. So let's say in the natural environment, you coincidentally have a static field, and then some radio frequency signal interferes with it. What might happen? It's an interferometry type thing. It's interference of different types of energy that cause these weird things. So think about this planet. You have so many different kinds of energy beams and fields going all over the planet. And you have different kinds of weather patterns moving around. And we do know when we get a tornado, you have the weirdest things happen. And tornadoes, where do they come from? They come out of nowhere. And it's a tremendous amount of energy that they pull out of nowhere. Free energy. So I see a lot of similarities with that, and a lot of things we should think about with regards to all these different kinds of energy waves that we're sending around the planet. What are we doing to the environment? Even if you don't see them, doesn't mean they're not causing a problem. And it could be that they interfered in a particular environment. A static field. There was a static field there. There's evidence of that. And so if you interfere these particular kind of radio frequency signals in that, and these birds happen to be flying through at the wrong place at the wrong time. Poof, down they go.
Instantly. Now, why is it just birds and fish? Is it just because they resonate with that field?
Fish. I don't know about the fish. I haven't looked into that any. But the birds have some strange things with them. Blood pouring out of the mouth. And there's this one I saw a video of that he landed, but he wasn't chirping, and he was walking around in circles, like his brain was messed up.
Like there was some neurological damage done to it.
Right.
Now, can it happen to humans?
Well, if we look at the World Trade Center, there's effects on humans. They were just integrating in there.
This is not a show for the lighthearted.
Sorry.
And no, don't apologize, because it's Judy, there's certain people in this world who just don't stay quiet because they can't and they're not supposed to. And your research is valid, and it's important for people to be able to take a look at it and come to their own conclusions, both personally and professionally in whatever field they come from, and to acknowledge the fact that you are staying out of the conspiracy circles. You're not trying to jump into, the whodunit and all of this other stuff, which I think is important in what you're presenting also, because you really are giving us an opportunity to look at the science, look at the evidence of these kinds of things, these kinds of technologies that are real. They are out there. They are at work right now, and they're not science fiction, and people who can't wrap their minds around it are going to have to deal with the evidence of these things. We are out of time. Judy, I'd like to say thank you so much for joining me once again for part 2. I wish you the best of luck, and when your book comes out, please let me know so I can make it available on my website for people to contact you to order also. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much again.
And everybody listening, it's up to you to really figure out what truth is. Use your heart and your intuition to guide you through that. And that's really the only advice I have for you after such an incredible amount of information. So good night. Live well. Namaste.